Hello and welcome to our lecture on Germany's domestic policies and domestic issues between the years 1890 and 1914. The intention really of today's lecture is to try and establish if there is any evidence that Germany may have went to war in 1914 to resolve any political problems that she was experiencing domestically. And there is, to some extent, a continuation in this lecture with what we examined in the Bismarck lesson, because the one group that is still a potential threat to German elites domestically are the socialists. So a good part of what we're going to examine today is about socialists, but it's also going to be about the social and economic changes that Germany experiences during this 25-year period in the build-up to World War One, and the extent to which social elites struggled to accept these social and economic changes that were occurring. Now, we're going to begin with a little task that I would normally do in the class with yourselves, but to save time, because there are other My City activities that I want you to do for this topic, to save time I'm going to kind of very quickly take you through this activity and basically point out the answers, but you may want to go back through it again in your own time because I'm going to run through it fairly quickly. You will have on your My City page this documents booklet, so you can access everything that I show you on here yourself via My City, but I've kind of shoved some of the sources on this display presentation just for convenience. So here are the questions that I want to run through, and I'm going to do this really quickly, and I think you know the answer to many of these questions already. So during this period 1890 to 1914, who was the head of the German Empire? Well, you are aware of the answer to this question. Here is the German political system, the constitution of the new German Empire post 1871, and the Kaiser is the head of this system, and the Kaiser has the power and authority to appoint the Chancellor and the Army and Navy generals. So question B, who appointed the Chancellor of Germany? It was the Kaiser. Question C, who had control over the country's budget? Well, there's a little bit of a change here in terms of where power rests, because at the very bottom it tells us that the Reichstag controls the budget. The Reichstag therefore can determine who pays tax and how much tax is paid, and therefore they have the final say on how money is spent. Now, in a country where there is power rested at the very top of society, in the Kaiser and the Chancellor and the Army, who would quite happily make decisions themselves without consulting the Reichstag, this could be a potential problem. We have to think about the German political system differently than, let's say, the British political system, where the King and the Prime Minister are part of the democratic system to some extent, because it's a constitutional monarchy. The Prime Minister is an elected representative by a constituency, and he's nominated by the political party that he represents. That is not the case within Germany, and the Chancellor doesn't really have any real affiliation with the political party, and because the Chancellor is not elected by the public, they have less of a connection to the Reichstag. So the Reichstag, or the German parliamentary body, doesn't quite have the same significance to these elites within Germany as it would be in other democratic countries. Germany is not really a democratic country in the years 1890 to 1914. She only becomes a true democracy after the end of the First World War. So the Reichstag can actually be a thorn in the side of the Chancellor. Question D moves us on to political parties and the election system. Who were the three main parties in 1890 that would play a part within this Reichstag? Well, if we jump another page, we see this this little diagram here, and we get the election results at the very bottom, and we get a summary of the political parties here in terms of are they left wing, are they right wing. what type of people might vote for them and so on. So what we can see in Germany during the period that we're interested in, which is from 1890 onwards, that at the very start of our period, the election results are to some extent a continuation of the period 1871 onwards, because the Centre Party are still doing very well, right? The vote doesn't really change that much, and it doesn't really change much over the next 25 years either, so they're a significant group. The Conservatives are a significant group, the Progressives are still a significant group, and the National Liberals are still doing okay. The Socialists are seeing a little bit of an increase in their popularity, but they're still very far away from being a party that would have a real say in the Reichstag, in spite of the fears that socialism held for the elites. So the main parties up until 1890 are Conservatives, Progressives and Catholic Centre Party. By 1912, who were the largest party in the Reichstag, so we'll jump again an extra slide, and here we get a very different story. By 1912, right, the final set of election results, we can see that there's one party who now has a massive 110 seats, and that party are the Socialists, right, or the Social Democrats, or the SDP, whatever you want to call them. The Social Democrats, in the space of 25 years, become the dominant force in the German Reichstag. That is a fairly remarkable turn of events. Other political parties see a fall in their fortunes. The Centre Party, as I said, they don't really change too much, but the German Conservatives, the Free Conservatives, the National Liberals, these are the kind of centre-right and right-wing political parties. They now only make up roughly 1/4 of the seats within the Reichstag. And I'll come back to that point later on, right? So we have to bear in mind that the Socialist Party now, as we get closer and closer to World War One, are the dominant political force in the Reichstag. Okay, question F says, examine the tables on the German economy. Can you think of any link between the Social Democrats' results and information from the tables? Let's click back towards the tables. Now, we see the population of Germany increasing. By the outbreak of World War One, it's close to 70 million. A lot of this population growth occurs in towns and cities, and therefore it is the working classes that are seeing their families expand. And if working class families are the ones that are expanding, then the likelihood is that over the course of a generation, this is good news for the Socialist Party, because these members of the working class are more likely to vote Socialist. This is a point that I made to you in the Bismarck lecture from earlier on. But the jobs that are created during this period are in coal, they're in steel, they're in railway building, they're in shipbuilding, they're in different trades. The chemical and engineering industries boom at this point within Germany. Most of these jobs, whether they be unskilled, laying railway tracks, or skilled, when it came maybe to the production of steel, they tend to be jobs taken up by this new group, the working class. Therefore, this is good news for the German economy. It's even good news for the German capitalist class, who own coal mines, who own steel plants, who own railways. It's good news for them because they are making lots of profit, but one of the inevitable negative outcomes is you also get this class of people, the working class, who are going to take up these jobs, but are also going to maybe question the unfairness of the political system, and obviously even the unfair elements that exist within the workplace themselves. Hence why many of the working class not only vote Socialist, but join trade unions who can represent them in the workplace in order to achieve better working conditions and higher rates of pay. The other points maybe to take from this is that the German economy is becoming a dominant industrial force within Europe. It can now compete with and that takes us to questions G and H. Which party do you think suffered as a result of the success of the SPD? Well, not so much the Conservatives, because Conservatives do see their vote drop dramatically. That's more a question of population and demographics, because if you're a Conservative, you're not going to switch your allegiance to the Socialist Party. The Catholic Centre Party do lose some votes, perhaps, to the Social Democrats, and the left Liberals and Progressives lose votes to the Social Democrats. Question H asks us about the tables again, and do they tell us anything about what might be going on in Europe at this point? And again, I kind of touched on this. Other European countries might start to get a little bit wary of German economic success. Would the British be jealous of this new competitor? How would the Russians feel about the agricultural developments that take place within Germany? How would France feel about having this industrial power on her doorstep? So, although it's not the fault of the Germans that they are economically successful, that they are transforming their nation into an industrial powerhouse, other countries are going to be a little bit cautious about this economic success of Germany. And the German Industrial Revolution actually takes place in a fairly short period of time, so they are a kind of a power that has just almost appeared out of nowhere post 1871 when the country is unified. Now, again, very quickly, I want to just conclude with question I, and this is just to give you a sense of the nature of the social system in existence in Germany in our period, and this takes us to page 6 of your documents booklet. This is a book by the historian Jeff Layton, and here on this page he gives us a little rundown of the different social classes that exist within Germany. Now you're going to have to read through this at your own time. I'm just going to point out the social classes. He talks about the landed nobility, right? So that's the wealthy aristocracy who live on large estates in rural parts of Germany. Then you've got the new industrialist class, or the capitalist class, or the bourgeoisie, whatever you want to call them, who are more likely to be located within towns and large cities. Then you've got the middle class. The middle class are split into two here by Layton. You've got the middle class, who I guess are the more modern version of the middle class, who work in jobs that may be in offices or in education or in government, and they might also be jobs where you have kind of scientists or technical advisors who have been to university. These are key middle class jobs. Then you've got the old middle class, who maybe aren't enjoying the fruits of industrial development. They are more likely to reside in small rural areas, in the countryside or in small towns or villages, and they might be craft workers, they might be shopkeepers. This group are often referred to as the Mittelstand, right, or the lower middle class. And they're an interesting group throughout our entire story of German history. The Mittelstand will be the group who first and foremost will be the most loyal followers of the Nazi Party. And then at the very bottom of the pyramid you've got a final group who we might refer to as the labouring classes, but the labouring classes again can be quite different. You've got the industrial working class, or the industrial proletariat, who live in cities and who work in factories and coal mines, etc. And then you've got the kind of agricultural labourers, those who have to do the work on these large aristocratic states for very little pay. And many of these farm labourers are in the grip of their aristocratic landowner and landlord. So these are the different social groups, and you can see therefore there's a potential for tension within Germany. But you should also note this is not unique to Germany. All European countries at this point will have similar, at least in the western part of Europe, will have similar social structures, including these kind of 5 categories of social classes. Okay, I'm going to come back to this page in a moment, but that's just a little brief insight into what Germany was like during this 25-year period in the lead up to World War I. So, what I want to do is just touch on a summary of this social, economic and political situation, and to do that I want you to highlight or maybe even write down the very final paragraph at the bottom of page 6, which is this one here. So, where it says, "There is little doubt, therefore, that the rapid pace of economic change in Wilhelmine Germany," Wilhelmine Germany is just the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II, so we should always bear that in mind. This Economic change had a fundamental effect upon the equilibrium, which means on the balance, of what was an already diverse society. Traditional structures and values were still very strong, so that's the relationship in the countryside, the relationship I guess between the wealthy and the poor. That's still very strong, but economic progress inevitably generated rivalry, and that main rivalry is social class tensions between the industrial proletariat and the new capitalist class, and tensions and dislocation. I'll come back to this point about dislocation later on. And for the government, it was the problem of balancing the old and the new, of accommodating the various interest groups in Wilhelmine society, which the political system somehow had to manage. And that political system, as I've already stated, was one in which was not completely democratic. And you've got a Kaiser, and you've got a military, and you've got a chancellor, and you've got government bureaucrats who are part of this elite who are making decisions. But at the same time, you've got the Reichstag, who are voted for by the population, right? This population is close to 70 million. And the question is, do these elites really represent the nation, or does the Reichstag represent the nation? And therefore, are we going to see tensions between what we might call the government, the Kaiser, his chancellor, his ministers and so on, and the Reichstag, the democratically elected body within Germany? And just to kind of complicate things a little bit more, as I mentioned earlier, roughly 25% of the Reichstag has political parties, conservatives, free conservatives, national liberals, that the government could go to if they want certain legislation passed. But that means that 75% of the Reichstag might not be sympathetic to what the Kaiser wants, or what the Chancellor wants, or what the military wants. And that is where we might see the potential for conflict. How does a government do what it wants to do if 3/4 of the Reichstag might not be overly keen on implementing policies that the German government would like to pass? I don't want to push that argument too far, and I will come back to it, because that 75% of the Reichstag that I mentioned, many of them are still very patriotic and nationalistic in their outlook. Okay, let's move on. I want to talk about political polarisation within Wilhelmine Germany. It's really just an extension of what we've been talking about, but I just want to kind of maybe explain a little bit more about the different groups that were present within Germany. Now you will find these groups on this slide here, which is a bit bright, and I apologise for this. For some reason it's not rather bright. I'll take you through these different groups. Now, these competing interests within Wilhelmine Germany in the lead up to World War One, these different groups are to some extent torn or conflicted about the direction that the country is going in. So what you have got next to each group are little arrows, either an arrow going forward, an arrow going backward, or the kind of complexity of not knowing what a particular group would like to see happen. So for many of the groups there's an arrow going forward and an arrow going backward, and that suggests that these groups might be to some extent experiencing what we call dislocation. They've got one foot in the past and one foot in the present. We'll start off with the government and the Kaiser for obvious reasons. They are the group with the most power within Germany, and because of Germany wanting to enhance her status around the world, they are in favour of progress, right? The Kaiser does want Germany to have the biggest and best navy, the biggest and best army, and for that to happen you need to modernise, you need cities, and you need factories producing all of these new technological advances in weaponry, for example. And who's going to produce these things? Well, it's going to have to be a working class, right? You need workers to produce these things. So, on the one hand, people like the Kaiser, like the German government, the Chancellor and so on, are happy with progress, but they don't like all of the progress, because with progress comes change, and that's change that could be a threat to their survival. The working class, I've just put a forward arrow, and that suggests that the working class are very much focused on the future. They are a new kind of creation anyway, right? They are a creation to some extent of industrialisation, and what they want is a better future, so more technological change, better rights, more democracy, better housing, better education, for some of the working class who see themselves as being Marxists. They want a revolution and they want a complete overthrow of German society so that the working class are in control of politics and the workplaces. The Catholic Centre Party again have two arrows. That's because traditionally Catholics in Germany probably quite like the older, more simple way of life, and the Catholic Church to some extent would have preferred a kind of society where values were more traditional. And what you get with the kind of shift towards city living are maybe issues about morality being thrown up. Some of the things that were on within cities would not tie in with the kind of conservative views of the Catholic Church. So that's why there's really a kind of back arrow there. So I've put a forward arrow because the forward arrow represents the fact that many of the Catholic Centre Party had quite reformist ideas and favoured social reform and policies that might help the poor. The next bubble refers to pressure groups. Now pressure groups could be a whole range of different groups, but let's just take one example, and that would be those who favoured territorial expansion abroad. Right? These were sometimes referred to as colonial groups because they favoured a kind of German imperialism to some extent based on the success of the British Empire. So again, on the one hand, they would like forward movement, technological developments that would allow the German army to be so successful that Germany could expand and maybe even invade other countries. But again, a lot of these colonial groups were very conservative and were opposed to some extent, weirdly, to immigration and so on, and having the kind of German nation being to some extent impacted upon by new groups and new races entering Germany. But at the same time, they quite liked the idea of taking lands and territories in Africa from people that they didn't really want to live with, they just wanted to exploit. The old middle class, who I mentioned when we were looking at the five social class groups, definitely are not in favour of change. They really want a return to that older, more traditional Germany where they had status within local towns as businessmen and shop owners and so on. Farmers, and by farmers I really mean big, wealthy farmers, the kind of landed aristocracy, they see industrialisation as a threat to their way of life. Many of the workers, land workers that they had, start to leave and migrate to towns and cities because more money can be made and there's more freedoms for workers in towns and cities. So the landed aristocracy are not overly keen on social change. The army, arrows going both ways. Again, the army, very conservative, traditional group, but at the same time they want the most modern weapons available to them, so they have to accept that there's going to have to be factories producing these. Then you've got the new middle class, who I mentioned briefly, and again they're a little bit of a mix of wanting progress and wanting things to stay the same, because some of their values again are Protestant and conservative, but at the same time they quite like the new lifestyles that are afforded to them within cities, department stores, cabaret clubs, especially in Berlin, where new forms of leisure can be pursued. Then you've got industrialists who obviously want progress. They want to see their factories get bigger and bigger. They want to make more and more profit. But again, industrialists recognise that with economic progress will come demands from the working class for social justice and better pay and all the rest of it, that will see class conflict between the capitalist class and the working class within Germany. And then finally you get national minorities. We don't have to worry too much about this group, but you can imagine that those national minorities would actually like some type of change, but what they want is a change back to the past, where they can perhaps not be part of Germany and maybe return to Poland, the territories that Germany have maybe taken from other countries, in Denmark or in France and Alsace and Lorraine. So the reason I go through this slide is just to show you the complexity of the German nation, but also to show that maybe the working class are kind of alone in terms of being the group who really want Germany to kind of become more of a proper democracy, or maybe even a workers' democracy. And this is going to cause problems, this is going to lead to conflict, and the question is, how will the government address these problems between 1890 and 1914? I want to give you a little example of these kind of contrasting views that existed within Germany during this period, just by looking at one source. Right, there's a primary source that you can read on My City, and it's a primary source that is about a kind of wealthy aristocrat who makes his way to Berlin for the day. And it's whilst he's in Berlin that this individual basically goes to a department store, and when he's in this department store, he doesn't have the best of times, right? He's kind of a little bit discombobulated, right? He's not he's not keen on this new middle class bourgeois experience, right? So the reason why I want to show you this, or want to read through this little extract, is because the divisions, or the potential divisions within Germany, are not just between workers and the industrialists. It's not just between landless labourers and landed aristocrats. It's kind of just general changes that are taking place. The differences between city and rural parts of the country, and that's kind of what comes across here. This guy doesn't in any way whatsoever seem to enjoy what Berlin, this metropolis in the heart of the country, he doesn't seem to really enjoy what's on offer. So here, I'm just going to read this little summary. As I said, you've got this yourself on pages 17 and 18 on My City. So what we've got here is a little account of what is referred to as an unlucky afternoon spent in Berlin's giant Wertheim department store. This is written in 1903, and it's an account written by an aristocrat named Frieder von Zobeltitz, and we get a sense of him being slightly lost in this new world. So Zobeltitz says, "It was a matter of purchasing an assortment of items that my wife said were better and cheaper at Wertheim's department store. So, first I tried to get my bearings in the store. I don't easily get lost, but here my topographical talents abandoned me altogether. The streaming mass of humanity pushed me this way and that. I wanted to get to the perfumes and ended up in hardware. Then, suddenly, I was standing in front of a woman showing me handkerchiefs, and half a minute later I had stumbled onto enamelled utensils. One of the official guides, a man who looked like a diplomatic under-secretary, told me I should use the elevator or the escalator. This I proceeded to do, but I found myself in a painting exhibit. A man who looked like a privy councillor from the Ministry of Culture could see my embarrassment and asked me what I was looking for. Up, he said, smiling, and pointed to the elevator. But I hadn't paid attention. The elevator was going down, not up, and when I looked around I was in a magnificent hall with lapis lazuli columns and a roaring fountain. This was getting a bit tiresome. I pressed on with weary steps, came to a palm garden and a buffet where a cute little girl presented me with a glass of lemonade. Next I was in a muddle of children's garments, then to the photographs, and finally to the perfumes I was looking for. Thank God, at last." The author of this book, where this source is included, then says, "City dwellers often judged their immediate environments according to yardsticks taken from their former surroundings." So this guy is now in the city, but he's comparing it to what he was used to in the past, which was his traditional socio and economic milieu or environment. And Zobeltitz gets muddled and he gets confused because he doesn't really belong here. He doesn't really belong in the world of commercialism and consumerism and bourgeois and middle class luxury. And that is another example of the dislocation that exists within Germany. Now, if von Zobeltitz, and I'll just kind of carry on by showing you some images here, right? If von Zobeltitz is used to this type of environment, right, the kind of wealthy, very palatial and grand rural residence that he and people like him would have lived in, if he is used to this but really struggles to deal with this middle class world in early 1900s Berlin, then how alien is the lives of the working class who are now emerging within Germany? How alien are they going to be to him? He's going to see himself not only as completely superior to these people, but he's going to think that these people are almost from a different planet. Here you can see Berlin, right, and this is Unter den Linden, the main street that runs up Berlin, and it's affluent and very appealing with cafe culture and so on for the middle classes. But as you go further east into the working class districts out here, and you can see some of the factories and so on, then what you get is people living their life a little bit more like this here. Camped conditions in Berlin slums, lots of kids, animals, pretty horrendous living conditions, right? But the norm for much of the working class who were at the very heart of this industrial revolution. So von Zumwaltitz and the German aristocracy, if he is representative of them all, and there's no reason to think that he is not, even though this is only one source, he is literally stuck in between two newer versions of Germany, the industrial city and the middle class world, and the industrial city and the lives of the working class. And this is a problem, I guess, for the German government, because it's another indication of a kind of country which is, on the one hand, going forward, but on the other hand has many sections or segments who are not overly keen on this progression. Okay, the final thing I'm going to look at now is the political crisis in Wilhelmine, Germany. And the final thing I'm going to look at is the Socialist Party. And just to kind of reaffirm some of the points that I made earlier on, we have in 1890 the Socialist Party on 35 seats, but by 1912 they are on 110 seats. Okay, so that's a massive increase for the Socialist Party, and I just want to maybe look at what the kind of ramifications of this might be. So the SPD were treated by disdain by the German government during the Bismarck period. This does not change under the Wilhelmine period either. On page 8 of your documents booklet, there is a quote. And this quote is actually a statement made in 1891 by the Kaiser, and the Kaiser makes it very clear in this statement as he's talking to new soldiers who the enemy of Germany is. So he says, "Recruits, you have sworn me allegiance. That children of my guard means that you are now my soldiers. You have given yourselves over to me, body and soul. There is only one enemy for you, and that is my enemy. With the present socialist agitation, it may be that I shall order you to shoot down your own families. That would include, yes, your brothers, your parents, which may God forbid, but then you too must follow my orders without a murmur." So we get a sense within Germany that the Kaiser does see the Socialist Party, not necessarily the working class, but those who vote socialist, those who are members of trade unions, he sees them as being the enemy of Germany. Now, this is a good quote, but it does not necessarily mean that the Kaiser would, shoot socialists, right? But it gives us a sense of this problem that Germany has of having conflicting and competing groups. The SPD, as you know, right, were the largest force in the Reichstag, and they could make life difficult for the Kaiser if he wanted to pass a military bill, for example, because, as you know, the Reichstag controls the budget, and therefore the military and tariff bills, taxation bills, might not be passed in a way that this small elite of government would like. So what the German government really does during this period in the build-up to World War I is it kind of accepts that the socialists might be a lost cause, right? That the working class might not necessarily stop voting for them and shift their attention to other political parties. So what the government tries to do is it tries to consolidate the wealthy, tries to consolidate the aristocrats and maybe bring aristocrats and industrialists together, which would never have been the case before, but they have one thing in common, and what they have in common is their opposition to socialism, but also opposition to democracy itself. And also you can maybe bring into this kind of coalition colonial groups as well, the Pan-German League, those who were nationalist in their thinking and opposed to socialism. So what the government does is it rallies together a certain section of the population, maybe that 25% within the Reichstag, and we have a policy or an approach known as Sammlungspolitik. And Sammlungspolitik just means a policy of concentration. It just really means about rallying this segment of the nation. And if some of the working class get on board and jump on the idea of nationalism and patriotism, then so be it. That's a good outcome for the German government. Because there was very little else that the government could do to stop the growth of the SPD. I just want to finally go to this last slide. This is a kind of slightly controversial point, and it says, did the German government go to war in 1914 to unite the nation? So was there a view that maybe there had been very little kind of movement in terms of restricting the success of the Social Democrats? Maybe there was a view that 110 seats in 1912 could be even more seats at a future election. Were the socialists to some extent unstoppable under the current system, and therefore was it going to be necessary to take much more drastic action? Is there any evidence to suggest that the Kaiser and the Chancellor would favour a war in 1914 just so that they could see the Reichstag suspended, the Socialist Party broken up, and Germany move on and have a successful war where nationalism would become the binding force for the nation? Page 11 of your documents booklet is very important because it has a section there from the historian Wehler, and Wehler's views take this position that when the German government does decide to build a navy and embark upon an aggressive foreign policy, Wehler says it's not for foreign policy reasons, but it's initially to solve domestic problems. Okay, thank you for watching and listening.